Good afternoon. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today to represent Concern. My name is Lucia Ennis. I'm the Regional Director for Asia. So I cover Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh and DPRK. So today my presentation will look at the Rohingya in exile over 40 years, but also Concern's work. So I'm going to try and contextualize and make real some of the issues that were spoken about earlier from our three other speakers. So who are the Rohingya? I think many people have heard the word, but actually the history of the Rohingya is not well known, or their identity. Basically, they're an ethnic Muslim minority. They come from Rakhine State, which is in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. So colonization had a big impact on the Rohingya. In the 18th century, Burma was a British colony. They were trading, there was a lot of trade going on between Bangladesh and Myanmar, but actually a lot of people from Bengal, from India and Bangladesh also went to Myanmar, and they were Muslim. In Myanmar, there was a majority population were Buddhist. So originally it was for trading that they settled there, but actually animosity and competition between the two communities commenced. Then around the Second World War, Japan, obviously, the war took place. The Buddhists from Burma took sides with Japan, whereas the Rohingya people, who were mostly Muslim, were more familiar with the British in that. So that just exacerbated the animosity. Myanmar got its independence around 1948, but there have been recurrent crises in 40 years. And there's been generations of exile for the Rohingya people. Mostly they fled to Bangladesh, and probably because it's nearer for them to travel. You can actually see Myanmar, it's a stone's throw away from Bangladesh. Just a river splits the two. But basically, as for the Rohingya people in Myanmar, what were they fleeing? They were never recognized really as citizens. Even in the census in country, and there was polls around 1971, the Myanmar state would not recognize them as citizens. So Concern has been working in Bangladesh for 40 years, so we were actually able to respond quite quickly to the needs on the ground. But the sheer number and scale of people that moved was substantial, and hadn't seen the likes of it, ironically, since Rwanda, that was mentioned earlier. So there were refugees actually already settled in Cox's Bazar in camps. But what happened was, when most of these people came, they just they had come, they'd fled with nothing, they had been traumatized. They'd suffered massive human rights. People talk about this as a humanitarian crisis, but it's actually a human rights crisis as well. So today there's in fact 1.3 million people in need of aid and support. So in terms of funding, always as humanitarians we talk about the needs are great, and then how will the international community and donors support those needs. At the moment, actually this week it was announced that the response is 45% funded. In fact, they need about 951 million to run the services there. So there's sizable funding gaps that still hinder in many sectors. In terms of the humanitarian response, the UN are there, but very much the invitation and the hospitality of the Bangladeshis has been significant in terms of nearly 1.3 million in a country that's already poor. They're already on the hunger index there, and they're always dealing with their vulnerability and risks around climate change and ongoing emergencies. But the response is actually directed from Dhaka, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who works closely with the Ministry of Relief. But it's decentralized to Cox's Bazar, which is like, it's an unusual place to go to. It's a beach area. It's actually a tourist area for a lot of Bangladeshis. And then the camps are about, well, if the traffic and you can get, it's about an hour from Cox's Bazar, where most of the camps are. But they're managed by the Treble RC, and then you have the camps in charge. There's a number of donors and aid agencies and international community there at the moment. In terms of, as I said, Concern's initial response was to meet the immediate needs. So we did that with food items, NFIs, hygiene kits. There were just timely distributions as a stopgap measures initially. So Concern initially set up, well, it took a few months, but over those few months we have established 9 orthopedic therapeutic centres. So we're integrating SAM, treatment and preventative approaches. They're then treated with plumpy nut, ready-to-use therapeutic food. And some of you might be familiar with this. It's a peanutty taste. So most children like it. But what you see in this photograph is they actually go through a testing, because some children might be allergic or they won't eat it, but they have to eat the full quantity or it won't work. And that child, and they're counselled by our team as well, in that they don't want they can't share that with other children in the family as well. It's important that the whole treatment is followed through. There's also a paediatric nurse there, part of Concern's team, and some of the children might have fever or need antibiotics or the like, so they go through that screening. But one of the main emphases on our approach is infant and young child feeding, IYCF. So Concern works with promoting the importance of good feeding practice through breastfeeding. And I think Julian, the ambassador, mentioned the importance of the 1,000 days. So we work mother support groups, counselling to address challenges faced by mothers and their secondary caregivers. We also do some community kitchen recipe development and cooking demonstrations. We also promote dietary diversity and doing some sack gardening. Of late then, we've started partnering with WFP, and instead of just addressing the needs of the pregnant and lactating women and the children with the plumpy nut and counselling, we felt that there was other needs in terms of supplementary feeding and targeted supplementary feeding program, and that's a more holistic approach to nutrition with more food contributed. So we also strengthen community mobilisation and in terms of timely treatment. So in the camps, access is difficult, and Concern have to leave the camps at 4 o'clock every day. So it's very important that we have mobilisers that can go into the camps, that can meet the community, and they're from the community. They're community mobilisers. So when they identify or hear of a child that's malnourished or somebody that needs our services, or if they can't make it to the camp, that they're there and they're all part of our team as well. So for Concern's work in any country, and especially in Bangladesh, gender dynamics and protection are very, very important. In the likes of the Rohingya, the gender norms restrict women's mobility. So economic participation and access to education and decision-making powers are very, very low level. The congested living conditions of the camps offer little privacy for women and girls, so they are subject to protection issues. There is a high level of gender-based violence, generally accepted and unreported. Child marriage is prevalent and often as a negative coping strategy to reduce livelihood opportunities. So they're poor with very basic opportunities for livelihoods. In terms of how we work, Concern recognises that you can't do things alone. So we're very much involved in the clusters with the UN and the coordination level, but we're also involved in consortia looking at integrated programming. So although we focus on the food security and nutrition, we see our added value with 2 other consortia partners or consortias running in country. So we're working with our alliance partners and Wellfunger and People in Need on a WASH protection and food security program, and Christian Aid and World Vision in a new program as well. The core humanitarian standards, and I'm not sure how familiar people are with them, but they're central to how Concern our values and our commitment to accountability. So we are certified to the CHS. So if you look at this in the diagram, at the center there is communities and people affected by the crisis. So when we're working with the Rohingya or working anywhere in the world, we do value the participation of the communities, their feedback, their input, but also we have processes and procedures and responsibilities in place that even if our services or the quality of our program is not working, that the Rohingya can make complaints, and there is a mechanism in place. And you have to remember, this area of Bangladesh was a forest. There's one tree left standing. And what does that mean? That means degradation, there's no livelihoods, there's no forest, there's landslides quite a lot. So they're building on hilltops. What you see in this photograph is one of the camps where there's been, that was fully housed up to about 3 months ago. There was a lot of shelters there, but during the rains, there was landslides and people had to move. So the monsoon had its own challenges for everybody. Even in our OTPs, we had to rebuild them. Access was difficult. There was a lot of stress. Everybody was worried about how they would get through the monsoon. Concern worked a lot with different committees in the camp and with other agencies to do disaster risk preparedness, because they went through the cyclone season as well, and they weren't sure whether they would be hit by that. So just one calamity after another. So in terms of the programming, the government are restricted in terms of what type of livelihoods programs you can do with the refugees. It is limited. Mostly it's cash for work. So a lot of the refugees were working to rebuild the camps, rebuild the pathways. So Concern works with the cash for work and also has a voucher system. But one of the main learnings for Concern is you have to involve and work with the host community. And even when we're doing distributions, the host community in Cox's Bazar were as poor with lack of services before the refugees came as well. So we identify the poorest within those communities and we target them, and sometimes they will be part of our distributions. There is huge kind of pressure or stress between the host community and the refugees, basically over labour competition, depleting assets and contribution to social tensions. There's major security risk and the potential of violent unrest in the camps that are very overpopulated. So this matters in terms of the repatriation. The returns process is not voluntary, and it jeopardised the safety as conditions in Myanmar and Rakhine State are not conducive to their return. Concern recently carried out some qualitative research into conflict and displacement. And there's a very short kind of study on the Rohingya, and some interviews took place. So some of the learning or some of the observations that came out of that were saying that although there's been recurrent influx of Rohingya into Cox's Bazar, most of the attention highlights the most recent waves, and it's forgotten about the refugees that are there 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. What about their experiences? But there are some very key similar issues that they've dealt with. So their coping strategies are remarkably the same, including the shock and the initial fight and facing the challenges on arrival. Basically, they'd no access to food or hunger or shelter when they arrived, and life in the camp presented new challenges, feeling a shock, fear, and helplessness. However, it was unanimously agreed, and actually when I was in Bangladesh and I met some of the Rohingya, they said that life is better in Bangladesh because of the improved security and greater stability. So they were fairly traumatized. They ran from a really difficult situation. Both the new arrivals and those who have lived as refugees, those share the wish to return to Myanmar if peace returns. And I think that resonates with what was said by the other speakers. People will go home if the factors are right. But more importantly than anything, what they wanted really was to build a better life for their families. People have asked me what's changed over the 40 years or what remains the same. Some things have changed. The international community's there's coordination, there's diversity of services. The camp facilities are better. Shelter planned sites, the ones that are planned. There's standards now in place for the service providers. There's participation. There should be program quality. Safety and security and protection should be stronger. and the environment obviously has changed. But what really hasn't changed in 40 years? The political will, both nationally and internationally. So although the Bangladesh government have been very hospitable, they're very much in terms of operations with the Rohingya. They're very highly regulated. Access and movement, the Rohingya cannot have livelihoods. Their movement is quite restricted to the camps only. There's very little protection in terms of most of the international community have to be out of the camps by 4 o'clock. So most of the atrocities are happening overnight. There's no witnesses there. Registrations for agencies to work there is difficult and long delays. And one of the things that remains the same that has always been there is the hostility from the host community. Although I have to say I did meet some host communities and they were very open to it as well, because they're able to share the services with the likes of MSF in the clinics and ACF. Some of those services are open to the host communities, the hospitals and that they didn't have before. So in terms of what needs to happen going forward, the government of Bangladesh needs to ensure the rights of refugees are respected, specifically freedom of movement and livelihood opportunities, and that's in Cox's Bazar. Any sustainable solution requires addressing the root causes of the crisis, including a recognition of the Rohingya citizenship in Myanmar and their basic rights. Donor governments must use every available diplomatic channel for public opportunity to call the recognition of the Rohingya as refugees and promote the right for them to return, respect for the principle of non-refoulement. Donors must continue and increase support both humanitarian responders to ensure that response meets the core humanitarian standards and addresses the service gaps, such as psychosocial support and protection. And there needs to be clear lines of accountability for different aspects of the humanitarian response. There's dual leadership with the response between the UNHCR, so in the end, who is accountable? And then all stakeholders must develop contingency plans, noting the high risk of natural disaster that promote better planning and consistent funding given the protracted nature. So thank you. I hope that gave you a little glimpse of the life of the Rohingya and our work in Cox's Bazar. Thank you.